Trust me, you won't forget this one. A man who hadn't smiled in 2 years. A house full of gold, marble, and silence. And one small voice that walked straight past his guards, past his money, past everything he built to protect himself, and asked him a question no one else had the courage to ask. What that little girl said next didn't just break him down. Changed the rest of his life. Stay with me. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why some of the most powerful moments in life come from the smallest people. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you belong to? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know who's here with me tonight. Today's story is one of the most emotional ones I've shared in a long time. About a broken billionaire, a hard-working single mother, and a 3-year-old girl whose innocence became the one thing money could never buy. Get comfortable because this story is going to stay with you long after it ends. The little girl in the pink dress didn't know she was about to change a man's entire world. The Blackwood estate sat at the top of a hill in Connecticut, behind iron gates that had never once been left open by accident. Inside, everything gleamed. Marble floors that reflected chandeliers like still water, oil paintings of stern ancestors, a library no one read from anymore. It was a beautiful house. But beautiful houses can still be cold. Ethan Blackwood was 28 years old, and he ran one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast. Men twice his age called him Sir and meant it. Board members feared his silence more than his anger. He wore tailored suits like armor, and his handshake was the only thing about him that ever felt warm. He hadn't smiled in over 2 years. Not once. Not at a wedding, not at a holiday party, not even the day his company hit $1 billion in valuation. The staff at the estate had stopped expecting it. They moved through the halls quietly, like people walking through a museum after hours, careful not to disturb anything, careful not to be seen. Maria Delgado had worked in that house for 8 months. She was 31, soft-spoken, with tired eyes that still managed to look kind. She cleaned, she organized, she kept her head down and did her job well because she needed it. She was raising her daughter alone, and a paycheck like this one didn't come around twice. Her daughter's name was Lily. She was 3 years old, with a mess of dark curls always escaping from a ribbon, and a laugh that seemed too big for such a small body. Maria wasn't supposed to bring her to work. It was against the rules. But that morning the sitter had cancelled last minute, and Maria had no one else to call. She made a choice most single mothers understand, a choice between a rule and a paycheck. She chose the paycheck, and prayed Lily would stay quiet in the small staff room by the kitchen. "Just 20 minutes, baby," Maria whispered, kneeling down to Lily's eye level. "Mommy has to clean upstairs. You stay right here with your crayons, okay? Don't move." Lily nodded, solemn as a tiny soldier, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear chewed soft from years of love. Maria kissed her forehead and hurried up the back staircase, heart pounding the way it always did in that house, like she was one mistake away from losing everything. She didn't know that 20 minutes was more than enough time for a 3-year-old to get curious. Mr. Reeves, the estate manager, was a tall, humorless man who treated every rule like scripture. He'd told Maria on her first day, in a voice as flat as a closed door, "Mr. Blackwood does not like to be disturbed. Not by staff, not by noise, not by anything. If you value this position, you will remember that." Maria had remembered it every single day since. What she couldn't have predicted was that Lily, bored of crayons after 12 minutes, would wander out of the staff room, drawn by the soft golden light spilling from beneath a set of tall wooden doors down the hall. Little feet in light-up sneakers padded silently across the marble. She pushed one door open with both hands, the way toddlers do when they're determined and don't yet understand consequences. Inside sat a man behind a massive desk, phone pressed to his ear, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the room. He hadn't heard the door open. He hadn't heard anything in a long time, not really. Not since the world had gone quiet on him 2 years ago. Lily tilted her head, studying him the way children study things adults have stopped noticing. She walked closer, stuffed rabbit dragging along the floor behind her, until she stood right at the edge of his desk, staring up at him with wide brown eyes. Ethan finally looked down. And for the first time in months, someone in that house looked at him not with fear, not with careful professional distance, but with pure, unfiltered curiosity. He should have called for security. He should have picked up the phone and finished his call. Instead, he found himself staring back at a small girl who had no idea who he was, no idea what he owned, no idea what he'd lost. To her, he was simply a man sitting alone in a very big room. She reached up and pointed one small finger directly at his face. "Mister," she said in the clear, unafraid voice only a 3-year-old can manage, "why do you look so sad?" The phone slipped an inch in Ethan's hand. Somewhere down the hall, Maria had just realized her staff room was empty, and her heart dropped straight through the floor. No one had asked him that question in 2 years. Not one single person. Ethan set the phone down without ending the call, the voice on the other end still talking into empty air. He stared at the little girl standing in front of his desk like she'd walked out of a memory he tried very hard never to visit. For a moment he didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had gone tight in a way boardrooms and hostile takeovers never managed to do. "Where's your mother?" he asked instead, his voice rougher than he intended. Lily shrugged, unbothered, and climbed halfway onto the leather chair across from his desk, rabbit still in hand. "Cleaning," she said simply, as if that answered everything. Then, undeterred by his silence, she asked again, "You didn't say. Why you sad?" Down the hallway Maria was running, as much as a woman in soft-soled work shoes could run without making noise, which was not very much, and not very quietly either. She'd checked the staff room, the kitchen, the hallway bathroom, panic climbing her spine with every empty room. When she finally reached the study and saw the open door, her stomach turned to ice. She rounded the corner and saw her daughter sitting in Ethan Blackwood's chair, chatting to him like he was an old friend from the park. "Lily!" Maria's voice cracked as she rushed forward, scooping her daughter up so fast the stuffed rabbit nearly hit the floor. "I am so sorry, Mr. Blackwood, I am so sorry, she was only supposed to." "She's fine." Ethan's voice cut through her apology, quiet but firm. Maria froze, Lily balanced on her hip, both of them staring at him. It wasn't the words that stopped her. It was the tone. Not angry, not cold. Almost unsure of itself, like a man testing out a language he hadn't spoken in years. "I'll keep her with me from now on, sir. I promise it won't happen. I said she's fine." He looked at Lily instead of Maria now, and something shifted in his face, something so small most people would have missed it. Not quite a smile, but not the flat, closed expression the staff had memorized either. "She asked me a question. I didn't get to answer it." Maria didn't know what to say to that. In 8 months, she had never heard Mr. Blackwood say more than 10 words to any member of staff in a row. She stood frozen in the doorway, torn between the urge to apologize again and the strange, quiet miracle unfolding in front of her. Lily, entirely unaware of the tension in the room, wriggled in her mother's arms and pointed at Ethan again. "You gonna answer?" Ethan almost laughed. Almost. The sound that came out was closer to an exhale, but it startled him anyway, like feeling a muscle move that he'd forgotten he had. "I'm sad," he said slowly, and Maria's eyes widened, "because Mr. Blackwood did not explain himself to anyone, because I lost something very important to me. A long time ago." Lily considered this with the serious concentration only a toddler can bring to a stranger's grief. "Did you lose your toys?" This time the sound that left him was closer to a real laugh, short and rusty, like a door that hadn't opened in a long time. Maria actually took a step back, stunned. "Something like that," Ethan said. "You can have one of mine," Lily offered generously, holding out the chewed-eared rabbit toward him. "His name is Buttons. He helps when you're sad." The room went very still. Maria felt tears prick her eyes without warning, watching her daughter hold out her most treasured possession to a man who owned half of downtown Hartford and apparently had nothing that could fix whatever was broken inside him. Ethan looked at the small worn rabbit being offered to him with complete sincerity, and something in his chest, something that had been locked shut since a rainy October night 2 years ago, cracked open just slightly. "Keep Buttons," he said softly. "But thank you." Mr. Reeves chose that exact moment to appear in the doorway, drawn by the unfamiliar sound of laughter coming from a room that hadn't held any in years. His eyes went from Ethan to Lily on the chair, to Maria standing frozen with guilt written across her face, and his jaw tightened the way it always did before delivering bad news. "Ms. Delgado," he said crisply, "a word. Now." Maria's blood ran cold. She knew exactly what that tone meant. Ethan watched Mr. Reeves usher Maria toward the door, watched the fear flash across her face, and felt something rise in him that he hadn't felt in a long time, the urge to protect someone who wasn't paid to be protected. "Reeves," he said, and the estate manager stopped mid-step. "Ms. Delgado isn't in trouble." Reeves blinked. "Sir, the policy clearly states." "I'm changing the policy," Ethan said, and for the first time in 2 years, his voice carried something other than exhaustion. Carried a decision. Maria stood in the doorway, stunned into silence, still holding her daughter, still trying to understand what exactly had just happened in a room she'd been terrified to even walk past for 8 months. She had no idea this was only the beginning. What Maria didn't know was the real reason her daughter's laughter had cracked something open in a man everyone believed was made of stone. That night, long after Maria and Lily had gone home to their small 2-bedroom apartment across town, Ethan sat alone in the study, the same leather chair Lily had climbed into still pulled slightly away from the desk. He hadn't moved it back. He told himself it didn't matter. It mattered more than he wanted to admit. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he never opened, the one Mr. Reeves and every staff member had been quietly instructed never to touch during cleaning. Inside was a small photograph, worn soft at the corners from being held too many times in the early days, before Ethan had trained himself to stop looking. A woman with laughing eyes. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, wrapped in a yellow raincoat, missing her 2 front teeth, caught mid-giggle by the camera. His wife, Claire. His daughter, Sophie. Two years ago, on a rain-slicked October night, Ethan had been in a meeting that ran 40 minutes long. 40 minutes he would trade every dollar he'd ever earned to get back. Claire had been driving Sophie home from a birthday party. A truck ran a red light on Route 9. The call came at 9:47 p.m. Ethan remembered the exact time because he'd been checking his phone, annoyed that Claire hadn't texted him yet about their daughter's day. He never got that text. He got a phone call from a stranger's voice at a hospital instead, and by the time he arrived, both of them were already gone. Sophie had been 3 years old, the same age as Lily. Same wild curls that never stayed in their ribbons. Same fearless, unfiltered curiosity that made her ask strangers in grocery stores why their noses looked funny, or why the sky was blue, or, Ethan's chest tightened at the memory, why Daddy always looked so tired. He had buried that photograph in a drawer along with every version of himself who used to smile easily, used to come home early just to catch bath time, used to believe that being a good father mattered more than being a good CEO. After the accident, he'd rebuilt himself into something harder, colder, untouchable. Grief, he'd learned, couldn't get through granite. So he became granite. For 2 years it had worked. No one got close enough to remind him of what he'd lost. Board members respected his ruthlessness. Employees feared his silence. He'd convinced himself that numbness was the same thing as healing. And then a 3-year-old girl in a pink dress had walked into his study and asked him why he looked so sad, and offered him her rabbit, and laughed exactly the way Sophie used to laugh, and every wall he'd spent 2 years building had trembled at once. Ethan pressed his palm against his eyes, breathing hard, the photograph shaking slightly in his other hand. He hadn't cried at the funeral. He hadn't cried in the 2 years since. He had told himself somewhere along the way that crying was for people who still believed things could get better. That night, alone in the study, staring at a photograph of the family he'd lost, Ethan Blackwood finally cried. Not the composed, controlled tears of a man managing his grief for appearances, but the raw, shaking sobs of someone who had been holding his breath for 2 years and had finally, for one single day, been allowed to breathe. He didn't know yet what he was going to do about it. He didn't know that a decision had already started forming somewhere underneath the grief. A decision that would put him on a collision course with his own family, his own board, and everything he'd built his cold new identity on. He only knew one thing for certain as he sat there in the dark, the photograph pressed to his chest. He didn't want to feel numb anymore. And somewhere in a small apartment across town, Maria was tucking Lily into bed, still turning over the strange, impossible day in her mind. The day the coldest man in Hartford had almost smiled at her daughter, and changed the rules of his own house just to keep them from getting in trouble. Neither of them yet understood how much more was about to change. The next morning, Ethan Blackwood did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He asked someone to stay. Maria arrived at 7 a.m. as always, braced for an awkward silence or worse, a quiet dismissal for the disruption Lily had caused the day before. Instead, she found a note waiting on the kitchen counter in handwriting too careful to belong to Mr. Reeves. Ms. Delgado, bring Lily tomorrow if you need to. There's a room down the hall from the study with toys now. E.B. Maria read it 3 times before she believed it. A room with toys. In a house where she'd been warned on day 1 never to bring her daughter through the front gates, let alone through the front doors. She found out later that Ethan had personally called a store the night before, at nearly midnight, and ordered enough children's books, building blocks, and stuffed animals to fill a small nursery. Mr. Reeves had supervised the delivery with visible confusion, unsure what to make of a boss who hadn't shown interest in anything outside quarterly earnings in over 2 years. For the first time since she'd started working there, Maria felt something other than fear walking through those gates. She felt hope, small, cautious, but real. Over the following weeks, something began to shift in the Blackwood estate that even the walls seemed to notice. Ethan started coming home earlier. He began taking short breaks between meetings to sit in the little playroom, not saying much, just watching Lily build towers out of blocks and knock them down with theatrical toddler glee. Sometimes he'd read to her from one of the books he'd bought, his deep, boardroom voice softening into something gentler with every page. Maria watched all of this with a mixture of gratitude and quiet disbelief. She'd worked in wealthy houses before. She knew how easily kindness from powerful men could turn conditional, how quickly gratitude could curdle into obligation. So she kept her guard up, even as her daughter's laughter began to fill hallways that had been silent for years. But it wasn't just Lily's presence that was changing him. It was what her presence represented. A reminder that joy still existed in the world, that laughter hadn't died with Sophie, that it was possible to let someone in without the ceiling caving in. One afternoon, nearly a month after that first day in the study, Ethan found Maria scrubbing grout in the kitchen with an intensity that suggested her mind was somewhere far from the tile. "You don't have to do that today," he said from the doorway. "Reeves can assign someone else." Maria didn't look up. "I'd rather stay busy, sir." He studied her for a moment, the tired set of her shoulders, the way her hands moved fast and mechanical, like busyness was armor against something. "Is everything all right?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Ethan saw something he recognized instantly, because he'd worn the same expression in the mirror for 2 years. The particular exhaustion of someone carrying a weight alone and pretending otherwise. "The landlord raised our rent," she admitted finally, quietly, like the words cost her something to say. I've got until the end of the month to make up the difference or we're out. I'll figure it out. I always do. Ethan didn't say anything right away. He simply nodded, filed the information somewhere behind his composed expression, and left the kitchen without another word. Maria assumed the conversation was over. Another small kindness that wouldn't go further than sympathy. She was wrong. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at her apartment with no return address, containing exactly enough money to cover 6 months of rent, along with a short unsigned note. You shouldn't have to choose between staying afloat and staying with your daughter. No strings. Maria sat on her kitchen floor and cried for 20 minutes, torn between overwhelming relief and a deep, uneasy pride that made accepting help feel almost like defeat. She didn't know for certain it was Ethan. She didn't need to. Somewhere underneath the gratitude, a small, wary voice reminded her that money from powerful men rarely came without a cost eventually attached. She decided for now to say nothing. What neither of them realized was that their quiet, careful bond, a grieving billionaire and a proud single mother, brought together by an innocent toddler's question, had already been noticed by someone else. Someone who did not approve. Someone whose entire position on the Blackwood board depended on Ethan remaining exactly the cold, unshakable machine he'd been for the last 2 years. His aunt, Diane Blackwood Hale, had seen the delivery truck full of children's toys. She had heard whispers among staff about laughter in the study. And that evening, she picked up her phone and made a call that would set the next chapter of this story into motion. Diane Blackwood Hale had built her entire career on being the person who cleaned up other people's messes, and she had decided that her nephew's sudden, inexplicable attachment to the housekeeper's daughter was the biggest mess of all. "He's compromised," she said flatly into the phone that evening, pacing the marble floor of her own considerably smaller estate 2 towns over. On the other end sat Walter Grimm, the board's oldest and most cautious member, a man who measured every decision in risk percentages. "Ethan hasn't smiled in 2 years, Walter. And now suddenly he's ordering toys and handing out envelopes of cash to the help. That's not healing. That's a man who's lost his grip." "People grieve differently," Walter offered carefully. "People don't hand 6 figures in company dividends to a housekeeper's rent payment," Diane snapped. "I checked the transfer. That money came out of his personal account, yes, but it's the kind of impulsive, emotional decision-making that makes investors nervous. We have the Whitfield merger closing in 6 weeks. If word gets out that our CEO is emotionally unstable, unpredictable, forming inappropriate attachments to staff. Inappropriate is a strong word for a man being kind to a child," Walter interrupted. "It's a strong word for a pattern," Diane corrected. "First it's toys. Then it's rent money. What's next, Walter? What happens when he decides the company's next big philanthropic initiative should be decided by a 3-year-old's finger painting?" Walter said nothing, but Diane knew silence from him meant she'd planted the seed she wanted. Diane had never liked Ethan, not really. Not since he'd inherited controlling shares of the company at 24 instead of her, despite decades of her own work within Blackwood Industries. She told herself her concern was about the company's stability. Somewhere beneath that story, quieter and uglier, was a resentment she'd never fully examined. 2 days later, an emergency board meeting was called. Ethan sat at the head of the long mahogany table, aware immediately that something had shifted in the room. Diane sat across from him, papers stacked neatly in front of her. Her expression composed into something that looked almost like concern. "We've called this meeting," Diane began, "because several of us have concerns about recent changes in your judgment, Ethan. Specifically regarding staff relationships and use of company resources." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I used personal funds to help an employee facing hardship. That's not a board matter." It becomes a board matter, Walter said, not unkindly, when investors start asking questions about your emotional stability ahead of the Whitfield merger. Perception matters, son. Right now the perception is a grieving CEO forming an unusually close bond with a member of domestic staff and her young child. Her name is Lily, Ethan said, quieter than he meant to, and something in his voice made several board members exchange uneasy glances. And she's a 3-year-old girl who asked me why I looked sad. That's the entire extent of this so-called instability. A child asked me a question no adult in this building has had the courage to ask in 2 years. The room went silent. Diane leaned forward. Ethan, we are not questioning your right to grieve. We are questioning whether you are fit right now to continue steering this company through its most important merger in a decade. There is a formal process, as you know, for temporarily transferring operational control if the board determines the CEO is not acting in the company's best interest. The threat landed exactly as intended. Ethan felt the old cold armor trying to reassemble itself around his chest, the instinct to shut down, to go silent, to become granite again where nothing could touch him. But this time something stopped him. He thought of Lily holding out her rabbit. He thought of the sound of his own laugh, rusty and unfamiliar, echoing in a study that had been silent for 2 years. He thought of Maria crying quietly on her kitchen floor over an envelope that meant her daughter got to stay in her home. He was not going back to being granite. Not for a merger. Not for his aunt's ambitions. Not for anyone. You have 30 days, Diane said, sliding a folder across the table, to demonstrate stable, sound leadership before this board revisits the question formally. I suggest, for your own sake, that you distance yourself from complications. Ethan didn't open the folder. He looked directly at his aunt instead, and for the first time in the meeting, something like real steel entered his voice. I understand exactly what you're asking me to do, he said. And the answer is no. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the boardroom, leaving Diane's carefully constructed concern hanging unanswered in the air behind him. He had 30 days to prove he wasn't broken. He intended to spend every one of them proving something far more important instead, that he wasn't broken anymore, because 2 people he barely knew a month ago had helped put him back together. Maria found out about the board meeting 3 days later, and not from Ethan. She heard it from Rosa, one of the other housekeepers who'd overheard Mr. Reeves on the phone, worried about the situation upstairs and protecting the estate from liability. Rosa relayed the gossip in hushed, sympathetic tones during their lunch break. How the board was questioning Mr. Blackwood's judgment, how there was talk of complications involving staff, how everyone suspected it had something to do with Maria and her daughter. Maria's stomach dropped straight through the floor. She thought about the envelope of rent money still sitting in her dresser drawer, money she'd used exactly once, guiltily, to pay her landlord. She thought about the toy room down the hall, the books Ethan read to Lily in his deep, careful voice, the small, cautious friendship that had somehow bloomed in a house full of marble and silence. She had let herself hope. That had been her mistake. That evening she found Ethan in the study, the same room where this had all started, staring at a folder he clearly hadn't opened. I heard about the board meeting, she said before she could lose her nerve. I heard it's about us. About Lily and me being here. Ethan looked up, and for a moment, the composed CEO mask slipped, revealing something tired and human underneath. It's not about you. It's about people who are afraid of things they don't understand. It's about your reputation, Maria said quietly. Your company. Your merger. I heard the words liability, Mr. Blackwood. I know what that means. It means people like me become problems that need to be solved. Maria. I can't be the reason you lose everything you've built, she said, and her voice cracked slightly, the exhaustion of the last month finally catching up to her. I appreciate everything you've done. More than you know. But I think it's best if Lily and I step back. I'll ask Mr. Reeves to reassign me somewhere else in the house. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere that doesn't put you in this position. That's not what I want, Ethan said, standing now. And there was an urgency in his voice Maria hadn't heard from him before. It's not about what either of us wants, Maria said, tears threatening despite her best efforts to hold them back. It's about being realistic. I've spent my whole life being realistic, Mr. Blackwood. It's the only thing that's ever kept Lily and me safe. She left the study before he could respond, before the tears could fall in front of him, and spent that night lying awake in her small apartment, listening to Lily's soft breathing in the next room, wondering if she just made the responsible choice or the loneliest one. For the next week, Maria kept her distance exactly as she'd promised. She requested reassignment to the East Wing, far from the study, far from the little playroom that still smelled faintly of new toys. She stopped bringing Lily to work altogether, scrambling instead to patch together childcare with a neighbor who could only help a few days a week. Ethan noticed immediately. The house felt different without the small sounds of a toddler's laughter drifting down the hall. He found himself walking past the empty playroom more than once, the silence inside it heavier now than it had ever been before Lily filled it with noise. He told himself he understood Maria's decision. He told himself it was better this way. Safer for her, easier for the merger, cleaner for the board. He told himself a lot of things that week, and none of them made the ache in his chest any smaller. It was Mr. Reeves, of all people, who finally said something. The stern estate manager found Ethan alone in the study one evening, staring at nothing in particular, and cleared his throat with unusual hesitation. "Sir, if I may," Reeves said carefully. "In 8 months, I have never seen you the way you were this past month. Not since... well, not in a long time." He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. "I don't presume to know your business, Mr. Blackwood. But I've buried a wife myself. I know what it looks like when a man finally starts breathing again after holding his breath too long. And I know what it looks like when he stops." Ethan didn't answer, but something in Reeves's words settled into him like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples he couldn't ignore. That night, for the first time in a week, Ethan Blackwood made a decision that had nothing to do with boards, mergers, or reputations. He picked up his phone and called Maria. Maria almost didn't answer. It was nearly 9 at night. Lily was finally asleep after a long day of borrowed childcare and a mother stretched too thin. And the last thing Maria wanted was another complicated conversation with a man whose kindness had already cost her more peace of mind than she could afford. But something made her pick up on the third ring. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, careful and formal, the way she'd trained herself to be again this past week. "Ethan," he corrected quietly. "Please. Just Ethan." She said nothing, waiting. "I fired my aunt from the board this afternoon," he said. And Maria actually sat up straighter on her couch, stunned. "Not fired, that's not entirely accurate. I called an emergency shareholder vote. I own 51% of the company outright, Maria. I could have ended this a month ago. I didn't because some old part of me still believed I needed the board's approval to prove I was worthy of the company my father built. Tonight I stopped believing that. Ethan, you shouldn't have done that because of us." "I didn't do it because of you," he said, and there was something steady and certain in his voice that hadn't been there before, not once in the entire time she'd known him. "I did it because of me. Because I spent 2 years convincing myself that being untouchable was the same thing as being strong. Your daughter walked into my study and asked me one honest question, and in 30 seconds she undid 2 years of very expensive, very exhausting armor. I'm not going back into it. Not for Diane. Not for the merger. Not for anyone." Maria pressed a hand over her mouth, unsure whether the tightness in her chest was fear or something dangerously close to hope again. "I have something to tell you," Ethan continued, quieter now, "that I should have told you weeks ago. Had a daughter. Ophie. She'd be 5 now. She and my wife Claire were killed in a car accident 2 years ago, on a night I was 40 minutes late leaving a meeting that didn't matter at all in the end. I have spent every day since then making sure nothing and no one could ever get close enough to hurt me like that again. And then your daughter climbed into my chair and asked me why I looked sad, and for the first time in 2 years, I wanted to answer honestly instead of hiding. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She no longer tried to stop. Ethan, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I know, he said. I never told anyone, not really. But I need you to understand, this isn't about pity or charity or guilt. Lily reminded me what it feels like to be a person again instead of a company. And you, Maria, you've spent this last month reminding me that strength and softness aren't opposites. I don't want you and Lily to stay away from this house because you're protecting me from a board that has no right to dictate who I care about. There was a long silence on the line, filled with everything neither of them quite knew how to say yet. I'm scared, Maria admitted finally. Her voice small in a way it rarely allowed itself to be. Not of you. Of this. Of hoping for something good and having it fall apart, the way things always seem to for people like me. I've built a very careful, very small life to protect Lily from disappointment. Letting people in. It's not something I do easily. I'm not asking you to let me in all at once, Ethan said gently. I'm asking you to let Lily come back to the playroom. I'm asking you not to disappear down the East Wing because you're afraid of a board meeting that's already been resolved. The rest we can figure out slowly. However slowly you need. Maria closed her eyes, picturing her daughter's face lighting up every time she talked about Mr. E. and his big library and the blocks they built together. She thought about the envelope of rent money still sitting in her drawer, about the quiet, careful kindness that had asked for nothing in return. Okay, she whispered finally. We'll come back. Neither of them could have known in that fragile, hopeful moment that the very next week would bring a crisis that would test everything they just decided to believe in, one that had nothing to do with boards or mergers, and everything to do with a frightened phone call in the middle of the night. The call came at 2:14 in the morning, and Ethan would remember that exact time for the rest of his life, the same way he remembered 9:47 p.m. from 2 years before. It was Maria's neighbor, Rosa's cousin, the same woman who'd been helping with childcare. Her voice was shaking so badly Ethan could barely make out the words at first. Lily had woken up with a high fever, screaming in a way that terrified everyone in the small apartment. Maria had rushed her to the nearest emergency room, but it was a busy county hospital, understaffed on a Tuesday night, and Maria, alone, frightened, with no family in the city and a growing sense of panic, had called the only other number she trusted with her daughter's life. Ethan was in his car within 4 minutes, still in the sweatpants he'd been sleeping in, driving faster through empty Hartford streets than he had in years. He found Maria in a fluorescent-lit waiting room, her face pale, her hands twisted so tightly together her knuckles had gone white. Lily was somewhere beyond the double doors, being examined, and Maria hadn't been allowed back with her for the last 20 minutes, an eternity to a mother whose entire world was a 3-year-old girl with a fever no one had explained yet. Ethan, she breathed when she saw him, and for once, there was no careful distance in her voice, no formal walls. Just relief, raw and immediate, at not having to face this alone. He sat beside her, and without thinking about it, without weighing the consequences the way he weighed every other decision in his life, he took her shaking hands in his. Tell me what they've said, he said quietly. Nothing yet. She's burning up, Ethan. She wouldn't stop crying, and then she went so quiet, and that scared me even more, and I don't. Maria's voice broke completely. I don't have anyone else. It's always just been the two of us. I don't know how to do this alone tonight. You're not alone tonight, Ethan said, and he meant it with every part of himself that had spent 2 years insisting he never wanted to be needed by anyone again. He used his name, the one that opened doors in that city faster than almost anyone else's, to get updates, to get a doctor's attention, to make sure Lily was seen by the hospital's best pediatric specialist instead of waiting in a queue behind a dozen other emergencies. It wasn't about money or power for its own sake. For the first time in 2 years, Ethan understood exactly what all his wealth and influence were actually for. The diagnosis came just before dawn. A severe ear infection that had spiked into a high fever, frightening but treatable, nothing life-threatening once the right antibiotics were started. Maria wept with relief when the doctor told her, and Ethan stood beside her in that hospital hallway, feeling something settle inside his chest that had been unsettled since October 2 years ago. He'd been so afraid, driving to that hospital in the middle of the night, that history was repeating itself, that he was about to lose someone else he'd let himself care about, and that the universe was determined to punish him a second time for daring to open his heart again. It hadn't happened this time. Lily was going to be fine. And somewhere in the exhausted, tearful hours of that hospital waiting room, Ethan realized something with total clarity. The fear of losing someone was never a good enough reason to stop loving them in the first place. Grief hadn't taught him that lesson. Sophie's memory hadn't taught him that. A 3-year-old girl with a fever and her frightened, exhausted mother had taught him that, in the space of one terrifying night. When they finally were allowed back to see Lily, small and pale but stable, hooked up to a gentle 4, already asking groggily for her rabbit, Ethan felt tears in his own eyes for the second time in 2 years, but this time they weren't only tears of grief. Maria looked over at him, exhausted and raw, and said quietly, "Thank you for coming." "I wasn't going anywhere else," Ethan said. "Not tonight. Not after tonight, either." Maria understood in that fluorescent-lit hospital room at 5 in the morning that whatever this was between them, friendship, partnership, something even bigger neither of them had said out loud yet, it was no longer something either of them could pretend was temporary. Lily came home from the hospital 2 days later, tired but bright-eyed, immediately demanding to know when she could go back to Mr. E's big library to finish the block tower they'd left unfinished. Maria laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks, a real laugh, the kind that had been buried under exhaustion and fear for far too long. Ethan showed up at their small apartment that weekend, not with an envelope of money this time, but with a homemade get-well card he'd clearly put more effort into than any board presentation in his career, covered in slightly crooked crayon flowers. He later admitted he'd drawn himself after Lily's usual art supplies weren't available at midnight. Maria opened the door to find one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut standing on her welcome mat, looking almost nervous, holding a card with a lopsided sun on the front. "I wanted to see how she was doing," he said. "And I wanted to ask you both something." Maria raised an eyebrow, cautious but curious. "That sounds serious." "It's not complicated, I promise." He glanced past her to where Lily was sitting on the living room floor, already reaching eagerly for the card. "I've been thinking about the estate, about the playroom that's currently just sitting there being far too quiet most days. I'd like to set up something more permanent, a proper trust fund for Lily's education, and honestly, I'd like you both there more, not because you work for me, but because that house has felt like an actual home again since you two started filling it with noise." Maria felt her carefully guarded walls waver dangerously. "Ethan, that's a lot." "I know," he admitted. "I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm not even entirely sure what I'm asking for exactly. I just know that for 2 years I convinced myself the safest way to live was completely alone, and I was wrong. I don't want to go back to that. And I don't want you to feel like you have to keep protecting me from a board that no longer has any say in this. It's just me asking as honestly as I know how. Will you let me be part of your lives? Not because of guilt, not because of grief. Because somewhere in the last 2 months, you and Lily stopped being people I felt sorry for helping, and became people I genuinely can't imagine my life without." Maria stood in her doorway, tears gathering for what felt like the 100th time in this story, but different this time. Not tears of fear or exhaustion, but the overwhelming relief of finally being allowed to stop bracing for the other shoe to drop. Lily already loves you, she said softly. She asks about you almost every day. And you? Ethan asked, quieter now, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen the composed, granite-faced CEO from that first meeting in his study. Maria smiled. Really smiled, the kind she hadn't let herself feel safe enough to show in a very long time. I think I've been falling for you since you laughed at my daughter's terrible rabbit joke. And I was too scared to admit it. That evening, sitting on Maria's small living room floor while Lily proudly showed off her recovering block tower and demanded a bedtime story from Mr. E himself, Ethan Blackwood realized that somewhere in the last 2 months, without any grand plan or calculated decision, he had built something far more valuable than any merger, any board approval, any billion-dollar valuation. He had built a family again. 2 weeks later, the Whitfield merger closed successfully anyway. Not despite Ethan's supposedly unstable emotional state, but arguably because of it. Investors, it turned out, responded well to a CEO who negotiated not from cold detachment but from quiet, grounded confidence. A man who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone because he'd already found what actually mattered. Diane Blackwood Hale resigned from the board a month later. Her influence gone, her carefully constructed concerns exposed as exactly what they'd always been. Fear dressed up as caution. A year later, the Blackwood estate looked almost unrecognizable to anyone who remembered it as a cold, silent museum of marble and old money. The playroom down the hall from the study had expanded into 2 rooms now, filled with the organized chaos of a well-loved 4-year-old's toys. Laughter echoed through hallways that used to hold nothing but careful, fearful silence. Mr. Reeves, of all people, had softened considerably, often found kneeling on the floor helping Lily build increasingly ambitious block towers between his household duties, insisting gruffly each time that he was simply supervising and not, in fact, enjoying himself. Maria no longer cleaned the house. She managed it now, alongside a small non-profit she and Ethan had quietly started together, funding emergency support for single parents facing exactly the kind of impossible choices she'd once faced alone. The choice between a rule and a paycheck, between asking for help and protecting your pride, between hoping for something good and bracing yourself for it to fall apart. Ethan smiled now. Not the rare, rusty half-smiles of that first month, but easy, frequent smiles that had become simply part of who he was again. The man he'd been before October 2 years ago, rebuilt slightly differently this time, softer in places that mattered, stronger in places that needed it. On the anniversary of Claire and Sophie's accident, Ethan still visited their graves, still brought yellow flowers because yellow had been Sophie's favorite color, still allowed himself to grieve fully and honestly instead of burying it under granite. But that year, for the first time, he didn't go alone. Maria stood beside him, quiet and steady, understanding without being told that some kinds of love don't erase each other. They simply make room, side by side, for both what was lost and what was found. Lily, now 4, had taken to calling him Daddy E, without anyone quite deciding when the shift happened. It simply happened the way the most important things in this story always did. Naturally, honestly, without calculation, the way children understand love long before adults remember how to. If you're watching this tonight and you've lost someone, a parent, a partner, a child, a piece of yourself you thought you'd never get back, I hope this story reminded you of something important. Sometimes healing doesn't come from grand gestures or perfect plans. Sometimes it comes from the smallest, most unexpected places. A child's honest question, a stranger's small kindness, the courage to let someone see you when everything in you wants to stay hidden and safe. Ethan Blackwood spent 2 years believing that being untouchable was the same thing as being strong. It took one 3-year-old girl and her chewed-eared rabbit to show him he was wrong. Real strength was never about building walls so high nothing could hurt you again. It was about opening the door anyway, even after everything, and choosing to let love in one more time. If this story touched you tonight, please take a moment to hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who might need to hear a story like this one. If you're new here, consider subscribing because we share stories just like this every single week. Stories about love, loss, and the small moments that change everything. And if you know someone who's grieving, someone who's forgotten what it feels like to hope again, Please share this story with them. You never know whose life might change because you cared enough to pass it along. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next story.